To start, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you at this session called As to Learners and Their Environment Strategies. I'm really privileged to chair this session, and I started to be even more privileged once I started searching for information about the two speakers that are coming today. The first one is Joseph Shaules, and I would like to say a few bits and pieces about this presenter. Joseph has worked in language and intercultural education in Japan, Mexico, and Europe for more than 25 years. I watched one of his lectures at YouTube, and I really loved what he said. Joseph said that language learning is an invasion, and I loved it very much. He's the author of quite a few books, and I'm quite happy to tell you that he will make the books available to you, am I right? At least the latest one, which is called Language, Culture and the Embodied Mind. Yeah, so you will be able to have a free PDF file. One more thing that I would like to say about Joseph is that it's right now it's 2 a.m. for him, so I believe it's a very special experience for him. I don't know, I've never had a workshop at 2 a.m., so let's see how it works. And that's all from me, and I would like to give my word to you, Joseph. Feel free to start your workshop, and thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to anyone who is here. I'm in California at the moment. I'm based in Tokyo. Is the sound okay? Sound okay? I am in California at the moment, although I'm based in Tokyo because of travel restrictions. I've been trapped here for a few weeks, but I am based in Tokyo, and as you just heard, it's 2 a.m. for me. And I'm trying to get used to this technology. A couple of things I have posted in the live stream chat window, link to the PDF of the PowerPoints today, as well as a link to a PowerPoint of my latest book. I've also put that into the Zoom chat window. I will be using a PowerPoint slide today. And I'm hoping to have some interaction. This is a workshop. It's a little bit difficult. Hello. So where are you? Where are you now?
I'm at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands, okay. And Donata?
I'm in London. I'm Italian, but I'm working in London.
Okay, so we've got the Netherlands, London, California, and Tokyo. I'll count myself as California and Tokyo at the moment. So I'm hoping to have some chance for discussing what we're doing today. I will be sharing my screen, and then I hope to also be asking you some questions and getting some feedback. I was very unsure about how this technology would work out, but let's just try and see how it goes. Do I have any way to hear? Are there people in the room that I can hear in some way, or is that?
There are. Can you say hello?
Hello, we're here. There's 2 of us.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear. Yes. Okay, so we've got. So let's see how we can make this work. This is great fun. Okay. Isn't this great? This is so fun. Okay, let me share my screen, and let's see. So my title today is Deep Learning, a Sociocognitive Approach to Transformative Language and Culture Pedagogy. And as I mentioned, I'm making these PowerPoint slides available, and there are the links in the chat windows. And also, this is you can also get a copy of my latest book if you have. So you can also email me directly if you have trouble getting these. My context is I'm in foreign language and intercultural education in university in Japan. I have experience setting up language programs, doing teacher training. I teach in an MA TESOL program. And I'm very involved with teacher education. And one of the challenges that we face in Japan, in particular, for language education is that traditional language pedagogy is still very common. And many teachers are using a lot of grammar explanation and memorization in their classes. So what I'll be talking about today is an approach to teacher education developed over a period of 10 years with cooperation from the Japan Intercultural Institute. And the goal is to encourage more meaningful and transformative pedagogy and to better integrate language education with cultural education. It's being used for teacher training, workshops, and it's being used for research as well. The starting assumption of this approach is that pedagogy, what we do in the classroom, is shaped in very important ways by the mental models that educators use. The assumptions that they have about learning affect how they teach. And in my context, what we find is that even when many teachers will study, for example, second language acquisition theory, it's very hard to integrate a lot of that information into the mental models they rely on when they're actually in class. So they often rely on some metaphoric assumptions, some common sense ideas about learning. For example, thinking about memory like a muscle that needs to be repeated, or thinking about learning like a bank where you just need to insert more and more information. And also a lot of teachers rely on a kind of information processing understanding of language learning. And this cognitive view or this information view treats language like an information system, like a set of symbols. And if you think about language learning as an information system or a set of symbols or a code, if you think about it this way, there's a tendency to have an emphasis on explanation and accumulation. So this is the background that I'm working in. So the challenge that we face is how do we develop more meaningful, embodied, culturally integrated forms of pedagogy. So the approach that we developed includes the developmental model of linguoculture learning. It's the learning model that we will be talking about today. And it was developed as an alternative to these cognitive models, and it emphasizes deep learning, which is seeing learning as an embodied process, as a transformational process. And I will be spending some time introducing this. I will first be giving some of the theoretical background of the developmental model of linguoculture learning, the DMLL. I will talk about the 4 levels of learning that it describes, and then I hope to have some interaction with the participants to discuss some of these ideas. And I'll have some other opportunities for some interaction as well. The theoretical basis of the DMLL, it's grounded in an intercultural adaptation perspective and a neurocognitive perspective. It draws on dynamic skill theory, embodied simulation theory, and dual processing models of cognition. If you're interested in some educators love theory, some educators hate theory. I don't know where you are on this. I like to be at the bridge between theory and practice. If you love theory, then all of this stuff is in the book that you can download. And we will cover some of these ideas. These are areas, theoretical areas, which are perhaps a bit less common in second language acquisition. I've said that this is starting with an intercultural adaptation perspective. So this model is informed by intercultural adaptation theory. And so let me ask anyone whose voice I may be able to hear. See, we have 4 circles here. Can you guess, what do these 4 circles represent? What process does this represent? Anyone in the room or on Zoom, just speak up.
Is that the invasion that the Lindemann?
Invasion, yes.
Language invasion.
Yes, the language invasion.
Culture.
Any mm-hmm.
The integration of new cultural and linguistic elements into the self.
Yes. So, and I like this. One person said invasion and one person said integration. And isn't this true? Isn't it true that it is an integration? We hope it's an integration, but it can feel like an invasion from the learner's perspective. And this is the intercultural adaptation element of this, says that, as you can see in the quote here, that fundamentally both language learning and cultural adaptation are fundamentally similar processes. The psychology of language learning and the psychology of intercultural adaptation are fundamentally similar. And this assumes, if you see language as an information system, you tend to think of it as a psychologically neutral process. If you see language learning as an intercultural adaptation process, then it's no longer a psychologically neutral process, because you must integrate foreignness into your sociocognitive systems. And this is not simply a metaphor. This idea that language is an invasion is not simply a metaphor. It's grounded in neurolinguistics and an embodied understanding of cognition. So this model is also informed by by studies which look at how the brain processes language. And if you have not seen this video on YouTube, I highly recommend that you watch it. It's called The Brain Dictionary. It reports on research where they have, through telling stories and doing brain scans, they can map the semantic categories of the brain, which areas of the brain light up for different word meanings. And as you can see from this picture, it's all over. There is not one individual spot for language. And one of the results of this kind of research is that they've discovered that linguistic meaning, that the meaning of a particular word, for example, in this case top, does not simply reside in one area of the brain. The word top can be found in a part of the brain that processes information about clothing, about numbers, about buildings. So this single word, top, is connected to different experiential categories. In other words, language, as it's processed in the brain, semantic categories are organized in terms of embodied experience. They are not simply symbols. They are not simply concepts. They are categorized in terms of embodied experience. So one of the insights from this kind of research is clear evidence that language, what we're calling language and culture, are not simply ideas or symbols or abstract customs. They're embodied, they are They are embodied networks of meaning that permeate our whole organism and are integral to the self. And when we start to look at language in this way, we start to see that language learning needs to be an embodied, fully engaging process, but much more than simply information processing. Another area of research that this model draws from is embodied simulation theory. If you're not familiar with embodied simulation theory, my personal opinion is that all language teachers should be familiar with embodied simulation theory. I believe it helps us understand the relationship between language and culture, and it helps us understand how deeply embodied linguistic meaning is. Embodied simulation theory says that linguistic meaning is not simply abstract concepts or symbols, that when we hear a word, our brain simulates the experience that is associated with that word. So if you say wet dog, for example, it's not the symbol of wet and a symbol of dog. It is an embodied experience. If I say wet dog, you may get the memory of a smell or the image of a dog shaking. All of that is, so language is experiential. And so here's an example. Let's go back here. My dog jumped over the pool. So when you hear this sentence, do you see in your mind a big dog or a small dog? Please just say.
Big dog.
Big dog. Small one.
So we have big dog and small dog. I've done this. If you do this with a group of people, you'll find that not only do they have big dogs and small dogs, you'll have poodles and Dalmatians and German shepherds in people's minds. How about the pool? Is the pool big or is the pool small?
Big. Big
Anyone
dog,
else?
big pool.
I have a small dog, so it's a small pool.
So we have big dogs and big pools and small dogs and small pools. Yes, so this is typical. So when we hear, so my dog jumped over the pool, wow, that's amazing. Not really. Linguistic meaning reflects experience. It reflects our embodied experience, and the same words can create different embodied simulations. And this helps us understand, for example, the relationship between language and culture. Because if language is experiential, then we can hear a conversation like this between an American and a non-American. So how was your weekend? Oh, well, Sunday was the 4th of July. Oh, yes, it was. So we had hot dogs. Huh? Did you see any fireworks? Huh? So what's happening here?
The other person doesn't know it's a special day in America.
Right. The person on the left is thinking July 4th. The person on the right is thinking the 4th of July. For an American, the 4th of July is Independence Day, and it's associated with fireworks and hot dogs and many other images. And those experiences, if you grow up in the United States, the 4th of July is an embodied experience that you have many associations with. So linguistic meaning, if it's divorced from experience, is very superficial, which is why when you say, bad words in a foreign language, it doesn't sound so bad. But when you say bad words in your own language, it feels terrible. So this is an example of the ways in which language is embodied. And one of the ways that this helps in language teacher education is it helps us see the relationship between language and culture, in that the explicit linguistic forms, the words and the sounds and the structures, linguistic meaning is grounded in the shared experience of cultural communities. And that shared experience creates an intuitive understanding of language meaning. So at the basis of embodied simulation theory is the importance of intuitive understanding, having a feel for the language. this intuitive understanding comes through trial and error and through experience. And it's different from the intellectual understanding that you get from studying words in a dictionary. So these are some of the materials that I use in teacher education to help teachers understand the ways in which language is rooted in cultural communities, and that intuitive understanding of language is a deeper understanding of language. So we talk about deep learning in this model, and deep learning in this sense is one that is intuitive, it's embodied, it is holistic, and the goal of this learning model is to encourage teachers to focus on deeper forms of learning in their classroom. So deep learning is a kind of organizing principle that the teachers use to try and plan their own pedagogy. So let's look for a minute at this idea of deep learning. Now we've looked at these four circles, and we've said that this is the invasion or the integration. But these four circles are not simply a metaphor. They're not simply cute circles. They also represent steps, levels of complexity as our brain creates new networks of meaning. And the neurocognitive bases of language help us understand that language is not an unchanging system that we're adding information to in our brain. Our brain language is a complex system, and we need to change the system or create a new system. And the DMLL is a model to help educators understand how this process of creating complex networks of meaning in the brain works. Can you guess what this represents?
Neurons, neurological.
So
Right.
neurons?
Yeah.
So some kind of neurological process. Anyone else?
Creating maps, like neurological maps or webs of meaning.
Mm-hmm. So maps, So a map, when we say a map, we're talking about something that's interconnected or systematic knowledge. So both of these are correct, and this image comes from dynamic skill theory. Dynamic skill theory was developed by Kurt Fischer, and he is an educational psychologist, and it's based on an understanding of how the brain learns complex skills. And simply put, to learn something new, the brain must make new networks of neurons. And neurons connect to each other. Those connections form networks, and those networks work together as a system. So in effect, our brain is organized as networks of networks at higher and higher levels of abstraction. So think for a moment about any new skill that you're learning. Let's take tennis. If you first learn tennis, the first thing you need to do is learn individual skills. You maybe learn the serve, you learn the backhand, you learn the forehand. Before you can do anything else, you have to learn individual skills, a single point of data or a single skill. What's the equivalent of that for language learning?
Some nouns, some vocabulary.
Yes, so if you learn a new vocabulary word, for example, that's an individual piece of information, or it could be
Or a grammar structure.
Or a grammar structure, or a particular sound, for example. Mm-hmm. So this is the first step of learning any complex skill. So this dynamic skill theory is not simply for language learning. It is a universal organizing principle of the brain. And that's one thing that makes it easy for learners, for students and teachers to grasp. So after we start to have individual pieces of information, we start a process of mapping where we're making connections between different skills. And so if you're learning tennis, for example, you may do serve and then backhand, or forehand, backhand, or serve and volley. What would be the equivalent for language learning?
Creating sentences.
So creating sentences, for example, is a way of where, in effect, we are mapping individual bits of information that we have, and we're creating connections between pieces of information that we learned separately, but we're connecting them together into a larger structure. So each step is more complex. This step is more complex than the previous step. And then the next level, the systems level, this is when we stop practicing pieces and we start playing the game. And at the systems level, these skills combine and they function as a system. And something that's interesting about this is it's a different experience to practice serving a forehand and backhand and playing the game. Those are very different experiences. When you are playing a game, you are not thinking about forehand and backhand. You are thinking about strategy. You are thinking about the game, and you are engaged with someone else. It's a very different experience. And so this reminds us that this is not simply adding new pieces of information or new skills. We actually shift into a new mode. Playing tennis is a different experience than practicing tennis. So what is the equivalent for language learning of the systems level processing?
Having a conversation in a foreign language.
So to have a conversation in a foreign language is very different from making sentences.
Yeah.
Because when we're having a conversation, we are using language to communicate. We are using language to interact. We are taking part in the system. And so at this point, we're doing fluency practice, for example, as opposed to accuracy practice. And so so at this level, we're using the language in a more holistic way. We're not constructing sentences in our brain. There is another level beyond this, and that is the systems of systems level. And that is when you go from being a tennis player to being a tennis coach, where you have joined this body of information to other bodies of information. So that is what we are doing here in this workshop. We are using our meta-level understanding about language learning, which is a level of understanding infinitely more complex than the ability to learn an individual language. So these 4 levels of complexity are very, we can see them in our everyday life, but we can also see them in the process of language learning. Now, what's interesting for me particularly about this model is that for learners, if they have not experienced higher levels of learning, they don't know what it feels like. Each level feels different than the previous ones. If you've never learned a foreign language, you can't imagine what it feels like to speak one. So here we have a naive language learner. Yeah, I speak Spanish. Una cerveza, por favor. You hear this, right? In the United States, you hear this a lot because we have many people in the United States who don't speak a foreign language, and their understanding of language learning is quite naive. So the point is that the experience of being a lower-level language learner and a higher-level language learner is different. And if we can help learners achieve these higher levels of functioning, they can start to recreate it themselves. Let me show you what I mean by this. Here we have four learners, And we asked them this question: what do you need to do to learn language? What's the most important thing for learning a language? And we get 4 different answers. One of them says, Juna says, to communicate, I have to learn many words. Vocabulary is key. Milpo says, I need to make perfect sentences. Mistakes prevent communication. Burke says, I need to understand learning processes and what works for me. And Gilma says, I don't worry about mistakes, just communicate. So can you rank these 4 learners? Which learner is the beginner? And which learner is the most advanced learner? And can you rank them from 1 to 4? Just think for a moment. Don't speak yet. I will tell you that try this with a classroom of students and see what their answer is. And then try this with a classroom of teachers and see what their answer is. Try it with beginning students and see what their answer is. Okay, so which student, Juna, Milpo, Burke, or Gilma, is the lowest level student, would you say? Anyone?
Milpo?
Juno.
Be brave. What do you think? Anyone else?
Juna?
Okay. So we have Juna. Okay, so we have 2 Junas, 1 Milpo. Which one is the highest level person?
Gilma.
Work.
So we have a Gilma and a Burke. So how do you know this? How do you know which ones are lower and higher? Well, you have a feeling. You have a feeling for the way that lower level students experience language learning. And if we map this onto dynamic skill theory, we can see that low-level learners often focus very much on the words that they need to know. They see language learning. They experience language learning as a process of acquiring. As they start to have more complex language knowledge, then they start to see it more as a process of experimenting. And they start to see that they need to make, and they start to become more concerned with accuracy and forming sentences. As they reach higher levels, they start to see it more in terms of integrating knowledge, focus on meaning. And if at the highest levels, when, for example, language educators, teachers, they start to look at learning processes. These levels of learning are something that can be used for students themselves to help them understand their own learning processes, and it can also be used for educators to help for language, for pedagogy. You should please notice that there are these arrows here between, and these arrows are very important because we do not simply go from a lower level and achieve a higher level and never go back. We are constantly switching back and forth between these levels of processing. Even in our own native language, if, for example, I'm speaking about a very technical topic, I might have to look up a word or think about a particular word that I need to use or form a sentence carefully in my mind. Our mind goes back and forth between these different levels of processing. So the dynamic skill theory helps us understand these 4 levels of invasion, of integration. And one of the strengths of this model is that it works for cultural learning as well. Because we have also, in addition to there being naive language learners, we have naive cultural learners as well. Oh, I know French culture. I visited the Eiffel Tower. You know, one of the things I like about being an American is that I can make fun of Americans and nobody can get mad at me. It's And you know, Americans are the one group, and you can make fun of them, and nobody will be offended. So I know French culture. I visited the Eiffel Tower. So let's do the same. Let's do the same thing, but this is with cultural learning. So we have Juna, Milpo, Burke, and Gilma, and the question is, which one is the least to most sophisticated? What do you need to do to understand culture? We have Juna says, I need to understand etiquette and culture do's and don'ts. Milpo says, I need to learn to see things from the local perspective. Burke says, I need to know the important facts and figures. Gilma says, you need to have a deep critical understanding of different cultural worldviews. Okay, so who is the least sophisticated cultural learner here?
Burke.
We have one vote for Burke. Anyone else?
Burke, yeah.
Burke? Okay, who is the most advanced?
I would say Gilma this time.
Gilma.
Gilma. Okay, how do you know? You don't have to answer that question. But my point is that you understand this intuitively because you are experienced cultural learners, in the same way that you understood the levels of the students because you are experienced educators. And this is one way to notice the importance of intuitive understanding, that what we want for learners is to help them reach these higher levels of intuitive understanding. So for culture learning as well, we move from facts. People in Japan bow. It's an absolute perspective. To a feeling of rules. Well, you have to exchange business cards with both hands. This is the kind of etiquette way of looking at cultural learning. When you go from the rules level to the systems level, to the I3 level, then we are looking at culture as a dynamic system, learning how to look from a new perspective. We're kind of entering into, we're playing a different cultural game, as it were. And at the meta level is when we are able to have a meta understanding of abstract concepts about not just another cultural world, but a more cultural general knowledge. So I'm going to give you one piece of extra complex information, which maybe is too much, but these four levels can function both in the conscious knowledge and intuitive knowledge. So you can have someone who has extremely complex conceptual knowledge of culture, but their intuitive understanding is rather simple. And so this is someone whose insights are not very deep, but who uses lots of big concepts and words to talk about them. Or you can have someone who has a deep intuitive understanding. Maybe they've lived all over the world, but they've never studied any intercultural concepts. So they don't have complex concepts to use to talk about their experiences, but their intuitions are highly complex. So these four levels work both at the conceptual level and at the intuitive level. And if you put these together, we can... So this is a kind of summary of the DMLL, which includes both language and cultural learning. The top half is how it is experienced by the learner, and the bottom half is the learning process of increased complexity. So this model has been developed over a period of about 10 years. It's being used in the classroom to help students gain awareness of their own learning processes, and also to help them understand the reasons that they are doing the activities that they do. It has been used in teacher training to help teachers understand the scaffolding and activity planning. So a small example is that inexperienced teachers will sometimes move too quickly from after introducing material. They'll introduce something and they say, okay, we've seen the vocabulary, now let's discuss. But the learners cannot discuss yet. And that's because looking at new vocabulary words is at the I1 level, and discussion is at the I3 level, and it's very difficult to make that jump. And if you have to have a critical discussion, then you're at I4, and that's even more difficult. So this has also been used in research to research the psychology of learning, and we just completed a 3-year study to develop a psychometric instrument which tries to measure this invasion. It tries to measure the psychological resistance to learning, because learners can get stuck at these levels. They can get stuck because of psychological resistance, or they can get stuck because they have they get overloaded at one level and they don't have the right kind of practice to get the next one. So these are some ways that this has been used. This is an example, a slide that I have used in my teaching. And at the beginning of the semester, I explained to students that when they get homework, that the homework will be one of 4 different levels. It will either be I1 homework, I2 homework, I3 homework, or I4 homework. And this shows them that this is deeper and deeper levels of understanding. So if we're working with a text, for example, we may have a task which focuses on a passive understanding, or an active understanding, a creative understanding, or a critical understanding. This also has been used for teacher training to help teachers see that you can use this, that the goal of working with material is to reach higher and higher levels of complexity. This material is also used, the DMLL has also been used to help with classroom planning, pedagogy, and the metaphor that has been used is the metaphor of the journey. So these levels of learning are the journey that we're taking, and in the classroom learners need to know where they are on their journey. They need to have a sense for where they're going. They need to have a sense for how they can get there, and they need to have a community that they're sharing this journey with. And I understand I'm going through this quite quickly. This is just to give you a taste. I'm hoping to leave a few minutes to discuss at the end, and of course, I'm happy to talk to you more about these things for anyone who's interested. This is the model that's being used for the research into psychological resistance of learning. And I won't try to explain it here, but fundamentally, the instrument that we created measures student resistance to learning, to cultural and language learning, and engagement. And one of the most interesting results of this research was to discover that many students are both resisting and engaging at the same time. They may say, for example, they want to learn, but at a deeper psychological level, they are resisting. Or they may have negative motivation, which means that they do their homework because they don't want to lose the points. So they are actually so this is a negative motivation. This is a form of resistance, not engagement. This is a journal article. If you're interested in this notion of resistance and engagement, then this is a journal article which is also available. We have a few minutes left, and I had originally thought if there were lots of members, we could have breakout groups. That does not, or we could have people speaking to each other. That did not seem practical, but we still have a few minutes, and I'd like to open the floor for discussion or questions or comments about anything that we've been talking about. So I have a question for anyone who would like to speak about this, and that is, I've been speaking about my context and the challenges we face in my context, and I'm curious about other people's context and if the issues that I've been talking about, how they relate to the context that you were working in. So that's one question that I'm curious about, but I'm also happy to hear any other comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this amazing workshop. And yes, let's start discussing. I'm not really sure what's the optimal way to manage the virtual environment as well as the physical one here, but I'm sure we'll manage somehow. So if there's anyone with questions, please, in the virtual world, please ask.
I have perhaps two related questions. Somewhere about a third of the way through, you said that the I1 way of having singular data is the first step of developing any skill. So actually practicing service and all that, and that makes sense to a certain extent with language. Although, if I remember how my daughter preferred to learn Spanish, was listening to music and getting the rhythms and getting the patterns and getting phraseology instead of actually learning first the vocabulary and all that. She was quite frustrated with I1 level learning because she already saw a little bit what at least I3 looked like, in that I1 wouldn't take her tremendously long to get there. And related to that question then is, with cultural learning, I teach in a language center, but I teach intercultural competence. One of the things that I prefer to do is I prefer to have people take a deep dive in the very beginning, but it's not building up the small bits to the more complex bits, but starting with a little bit of a perspective of the richness of the complexity. So I'm wondering a little bit, throwing up, a tennis ball to bash around back and forth on, is it actually as from I1 to I2, I3, I4, but are there other perspectives too? Or instead of bottom up, is there also a version of top down learning kind of thing?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. So we learn complex skills holistically. And so when you listen to music in order to get the sounds of a language, you are having an experience with the language, which is an intuitive learning process. And so if you look a little bit more deeply at the DMLL, it's actually, to really look at this, you need to look both at conscious learning processes and intuitive learning processes, both. And the difficulty with language learning, of course, is that you cannot simply absorb, at least adults cannot simply absorb the whole system simply by being exposed. And so we need some combination of holistic, intuitive practice and focused, conscious practice. So yes, absolutely. And of course, even learning an individual word, each word has a set of sounds, and you can focus on each sound and you can hear the word holistically. So it's not so simple to say that learning a word is one piece of information. A word is a system itself. And hearing a word spoken dramatically is different from hearing a word spoken in an even tone, for example. So there's always an intuitive, holistic element to learning as well. So you're absolutely right. And I think that one challenge for language learning is, how do we get these more intuitive elements of learning sooner rather than later, so that we don't have to have lots of information before we get them. So I totally agree with you. And for cultural learning, of course, having an experience is one way to have a very rich have a very rich experience, which you can then think through. So I don't see any. So you're right that this model is much simpler than the reality. It's simply a way to think about the overall process. I don't know if other people have comments about this question. I'm not supposed to be doing all the speaking.
Are there any other comments in the virtual world or also here? Questions?
If I could ask a question in connection to the brain dictionary that you talked about, where there are different semantic categories in the brain, would you say that there is something similar with grammatical categories? For example, let's say the present perfect, that the students need to develop experiential connections of the different uses of the present perfect. And if they just get the rules without the deeper experience, kind of a feeling for it, that the acquisition is not as perfect, I would say. What would be your comment on that?
So my understanding, and I'm not a neurolinguist, but my understanding is that cognitive scientists have not discovered grammatical categories within brain functioning. They have not figured out how that works. So there isn't a present, you cannot find the present perfect tense using a brain scan. What it does teach us, though, is that if using the preterite tense and the imperfect tense are different in my foreign language rather than in my language, you need to experience, it's the experience with those tenses, when those tenses are experienced as close to real life as possible, it's the experimentation and the trial and error which gives us that feeling for how it's used. I really don't know. I really think that my understanding is that our understanding of how grammatical structures are processed in the brain is very limited. So I'm not sure exactly what this research has to teach us about grammar study, except that the more embodied the practice is, the more holistic the practice is, the more trial and error the practice is, the more we will be able to get that feel. But I think those are things which language teachers kind of understand intuitively already, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. If I may ask a question, thank you very much, Joseph, for this lovely workshop. I wonder, because a lot of focus is paid on teacher training, let's say, the teachers should get familiar with these issues. What's your experience? Are teachers welcoming this idea of looking at language learning and teaching? And is there any difference between teachers from various cultural backgrounds? I mean, there are some teachers who are more open to these new ideas and some not so open.
In my context, well, in my context, traditional methodology is very common, partly because of the education system. And so teachers are just used to looking at language in this way. And if you're used to looking at language as information and rules, then it takes some kind of a mental shift to look at things in a new way, because you have to call into question your assumptions. I also find that in my context, not all teachers are highly comfortable in the foreign language, in the target language, if they are teaching a second language. And in that case, they may experience the foreign language more at the I1, I2 level, because that's how they themselves are experiencing it. And in that case, they need to be language learners even as they are being language teachers. I haven't had much trouble with people accepting these ideas, either students or teachers. Some people don't find it useful. Some teachers don't find it useful. But I haven't had much resistance. In fact, students, if you explain to students these 4 levels briefly, and you ask them, where are you? They will tell you. And they understand quite easily. And if you say, today we're going to be doing this activity, and it's going to be an I3 activity, so that's why you need to not worry about mistakes. Or if you say, no, today is an I2 activity, so you need to make sure and get everything just right, then students seem to adopt this quite easily. But I'm not in the European context, and even within the European context, of course, there's so many different contexts, so it's hard for me to speak to that.
What is the I standing for in your scheme? The I1, I2, what's the I?
It can stand for identity, and it can stand for integration.
Integration, yeah.
Yeah, so you're integrating it into the self, into who you are.
And can it stand for the I? So the self is, I.
Yeah, it's the I. So I think that, like, when we start to feel ourselves in the foreign language, this is like the I3 level usually, is when you start to actually feel like, we sometimes talk about the foreign language self or the L2 self. And I think you really need to get to the I3 level before we start to really experience this.
But this to me reminds also a lot of the focus on form and focus on meaning, and the task-based approach, and the the integration of both, focus on form and focus on meaning, and then working through it and having been and orienting your learning towards a task, which is the bridging, the integrating.
Yes. So many of those ideas, of course, fit very naturally with this model. This is simply a model that can help learners and teachers in terms of their own learning and how to plan activities. Yes,
it's very useful. Thank you. And I am a teacher's training, so I will integrate some of your presentation into my work. Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's you can download my most recent book, which talks, it's 250 pages of this model. So there's more than enough theory there for anybody who likes theory. Also, if you are interested, if you're interested in the work that I'm doing, you can send me an email, and I can put you on the mailing list of the Japan Intercultural Institute. We have webinars. We have a new podcast starting. We have a learning circle, and so please send me an email. And if you are unable to download the book, then you can do that as well. So here's my email address, jshaules@japanintercultural.org. Shall I stop sharing now? And also, I know we need to end now, but I am also willing to stay here for anyone who wants to continue the conversation. So I guess, is our time up yet?
In fact, yes, in 1 or 2 minutes. So I wonder if anyone has any more questions? No, Joseph. So because of time, we'll have to finish now. Thank you very much once again for this amazing experience. I definitely will stay in touch with you. And I believe the other participants. Thank you very much, and I believe sleep well. Good night.
Now you've got me all excited about learning theory. I don't know if I'll be able to go to sleep.
I'm sure you will be able to.
Actually, I just wanted to make one quick comment. I don't know who's Michaela. You said that it reminds you of the DMIS. That's because it's also a developmental model, which goes from higher and higher levels of complexity. So there are parallels between the DMIS and this model as well. I'm not sure what Milton Bennett would say. Okay, thank you everyone so much. And
thank you.
Bye.
Okay,
Thank you.
goodbye.
Bye.